Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Rocco's Basilisk. Rocco's Basilisk, for the uninitiated, is the scariest question or thought experiment in computer science. What if we get a malevolent AI in the future? And then it traps us all, controls our lives, but worse, it goes back through all of your history, all of your emails and tweets to see if you were one of the ones that supported it coming to existence. So now what are we supposed to do? Retroactively control ourselves and help that evil thing come into existence just so it doesn't punish us? Anyway, I'm here to say, no, let's have a positive future. There's no fate but what we make. And I want to introduce my guest today, Max Turnquist, who has been on before, the CEO of Stave, and also worked at Draper before that. And he's a very intelligent guy working in AI, and he has a very unique solution to AI safety that we'll discuss today. And Dr. David Bray, who is at Harvard and MIT and in the defense industry and in the actual defense department, and is now a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Institute. Thank you guys for being here today. And anything else you guys want to throw in at the beginning?
I would say, yeah, no need to worry about a dystopian future. We've got human enough problems as it is. And if anything, it may be we can actually use some of these tools to help us get through some of them.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, Max.
Max, what's your solution? It sounds like you have a solution to AI.
Sure, yeah. So first, let's because the solution is an answer to a sort of paradigm that people have been working in. Let's define the paradigm first, which is the "oh my god, AI is going to kill us all" paradigm. Essentially, it's the problem of, if there's a super powerful AI, how can we, if there's something much smarter than us, how can we ensure that we are not, we don't become lower in the food chain, it doesn't take over the world? How do we ensure that we remain on top? There are a lot of ways that it could do this. I'm not thinking it's going to be like a kill all humans Skynet type of situation, but I think there could be situations much more in line with sort of subconscious drives, subconscious game theoretic problems that it introduces to us. One of the example that I like to use is in Australia. There was a period where they had way too many rabbits. They had introduced rabbits into the wild, and there was a plague of way too many rabbits. And so one of the solutions they came up with was to figure out what male rabbits thought were, sexy about female rabbits, and then make a doll that was all those features exaggerated, and then the male rabbits would preferentially mate with those, and the population declined. And that, it kind of worked. But if you have something far smarter than us, maybe it will design systems for us, or we'll end up designing them ourselves, and it'll be implemented by them that we can't functionally respond to on an evolutionary level, and either turns the planet into this sort of hive matrix style prison planet type of situation, or we are eventually phased out as useful organisms. The whole argument of essentially the number of tasks that are payable for a human slowly decrease until it's nothing. And at that point, the AI is already running the show, so why does it need us? That's a scary idea. Well, my solution to this is that all of these, and you'll find many of these style arguments online, all of them boil down to the same sort of implementation problem, which is that at the point of genesis of an AI system like this, it will either be tasked with something, and this also is a solution to the gray goo problem. It'll be tasked with something, or it will task itself with something. At some point, it will want to do something. The very next step is it will either, if it's a trivial thing, it'll just do it. Like if it's a text response, it'll just, give you the text answer. Or it will say, I need to accumulate some sort of power. That power can be in the form of, let's say, electricity. It could be Amazon compute credits. It could be social influence. It could be anything, any way you can exert some sort of agency in the world. It'll say, I need to accrue this. It'll then go out and figure out a strategy to accrue the most power the most efficiently. And then once it's done that, it'll do its task. great. That's the sort of loop that all of these systems almost necessarily will have, because it's not an AI based interaction. It's a fundamental, microorganisms do the same thing. Well, that is the case if there is only one of them, or if there's a very small number of them. If we increase the number of these things dramatically, let's say, many thousands, many hundreds, or even millions, billions of these things, the number of agents that will be vying for this power will grow to be larger than the amount of power that can be accrued from the strategy space, because the strategy space isn't necessarily infinite, or the sort of power accumulation space isn't infinite. And I realized what this is alpha decay from trading markets, where if you develop a strategy, alpha, if you're not familiar, is if you're a stock trader, your performance relative to the just 7% a year S&P performance is your alpha. If you have a strategy that's great and you have 10% alpha, and you have two people doing that, all of a sudden that's 5% alpha. Let's say if they're both ideal actors. The more people doing it, the less alpha you have on the market. The solution space, or the strategy space for accumulating power, is probably going to be Pareto distributed, where there will be some things that are very useful for getting power, and there will be a whole mess of things that are essentially useless for getting power. So if you have a large number of AI systems, they will compete with each other, and there will be alpha decay on all these strategies. And if none of them can accrue the power to actually have dangerous capabilities, then they're not dangerous, and we don't actually have to worry about alignment, because sure, some of them will be misaligned. You will probably find some things that will accrue enough power to make a scam call type of situation, but you're not going to get these Shodan style world dominating AIs. It's if they're competing with each other, they're actors relatively on the same level with one another, they're not going to.
All right, I can see, Graham, why you invited us. So very interesting, Max. And I'm gonna probably come at this a slightly different direction, but I think it will link up. So my own background includes decision science and organization science, in addition to information science. And so along the way, I worshipped at the altar of Herbert Simon, who later won a Nobel Prize, and others. So Herb Simon,
I still do.
Yes, I still do too. I don't think I have shifted, but I say that. So Herb Simon, interesting enough, in the 1930s, looked at human decision making in administrative organizations. I believe it was upstate New York, and later came to how do humans make decisions in organizations. It's interesting because then later he was one of the, I guess you would call grandfathers of AI in the 1950s and 1960s. And so it's interesting how you go from human decision making to AI and the first wave of AI. I like to remind people, AI is not new. We have been doing it since the 1950s. It's gone through different waves, from problem-solving networks to the next wave, which was expert systems, to now what we have with machine learning and deep learning. That said, I would take everything that Max just said and replace the word AI with organizations. And it all applies. And I would say right now we are in the neo-Victorian era. We're repeating all the things of the Victorian era, in which there was rapid industrialization, technological progress. Guess what happened? There was distrust in institutions. There was polarization, at least in the United States. We actually had a more polarized Congress than we do now, believe it or not. There was disinformation. That's how Pulitzer and Hearst made their money. I'm waiting for the Zuckerberg Musk Prize in Excellence in Social Media to come out later. But, it was a kind of repeat of where we are now. And there were also Ouija boards, which, by the way, I believe that large language models are the modern day equivalent of Ouija boards, which is let's ask the machine whether we should do it. And you probably has about as good an answer. So anyway, so I think what's happening is this paranoia about AI is displaced from the fact that organizations increasingly are having massive influences in our lives in ways that they didn't historically. There has been the ways you can distribute power. There are at least three ways. One is you can distribute power through laws. Okay, organizations historically have not been able to make laws because they've never gotten big enough. That said, right before COVID, there were 5 companies in the world that had a larger annual revenue than all the world's GDP from all the nations, with the exception of the top 4. Now those 5 companies can influence laws. Another way that you can shape the distribution of power is through the narratives that you share. And what do some of these companies now do? They influence the narratives that are seen and not seen, and the messages that get out. And this paranoia about AI, I think, is a little bit of magic sleight of hand of, look at this more scary thing, which is this AI in the future, and not possibly these organizations that may be doing the very thing that you're concerned about. But again, that's where Max's solution works for organizations as well. If there are many different organizations vying for power on the world stage, you don't have to worry about any one of them becoming a superpower. But we might not be seeing that at the moment, because the bad news about the internet is it seems to follow the power law distribution, which is winner takes all. We human consumers don't want to have 10 different search engines to go to. We just want one. And so when people ask, like, why is that company a monopoly? Because we chose to go to it versus use alternative products. And same thing for, we want to go to where our friends are having conversations. We don't want to have umpteen different solutions. And so we'll see what happens now with this latest competitor. But anyway, I think my own takeaway is, because again, if we start to get worried about AI becoming malevolent, hold the power. I have seen no one demonstrate to me that somehow the AI magically develops a way to generate power on its own. And even if it does, okay, give it an EMP burst. Done. I'm like, I am not worried about the machine. I am worried about humans forming organizations that are subtly influencing the world stages in ways that have removed the ability for individuals in representative societies, free societies, to have an influence on what actually happens, that we are doing the theater of republics and democracies, but it's a theater, and that's what I worry about. So, but that said, I'll go back one more time and say, the other thing I would say is that research has shown humans are willing to trust an entity. And by trust, I mean be vulnerable to an actions of an entity they cannot directly control. So that could be a person, that could be an organization or company, that could be a government, that could also be an AI. If 3 things are present, we perceive that that entity is competent, we perceive that that entity is benevolent, and we perceive that that entity operates with integrity. If those 3 things are present, then we are willing to be trusting, in other words, vulnerable to the actions of an entity we cannot directly control, if those things are present. So let's think about large language models. Competence. Nope, they can't distinguish between facts. They don't even know what facts are versus lies. They just repeat back what they were trained on. So no, not going to work.
Well, if I can interrupt for a second, it's more about whether or not the person perceives them to be competent than their actual competence.
100%. It's all about perception. So yes. So I would agree.
I think most people would perceive them to be quite competent.
Because there's a good PR campaign going on at the moment. But yes, and so that requires probably some of us to begin to point out when it gets wrong. Second, benevolence.
Nope.
I don't think it's not, there's no objective function into what's going on with the LM. There's no benevolence.
Finally, integrity.
Finally, integrity. I'm pretty sure if you go back and say, no, that's wrong, it'll come back to you, say, oh, my apologies, and then either give you something else or give you some other hallucination to whatever you said. So integrity is definitely out the window. So yeah, not ready to trust LLMs, but let's also apply that to, again, organizations. How many organizations demonstrate on a daily basis competence? And again, some of them have really good PR firms, and people lament that the US government or other governments are not competent. I'm like, no, they just don't have a PR firm that's actually making their case. In fact, they have, at least in the United States, we have 535 members whose very incentive is to rail on the fact that, something is not competent and therefore you need to reelect them. So we actually have the opposite of a PR firm relative to private sector organizations. But I would say all organizations have cases where something didn't work out well. It's just some organizations have the very incentive to hide, as opposed to the good news about our government is you will find out from some, and you will even find things that are manufactured found out because that's part of motivation. And then lastly, the integrity bit. So I think the solution here, or what I would come back and say is, the very things that we may need in the far-fetched future for AI, we need to start insisting for organizations, whether they be private sector or public sector organizations now. This is what we need for society, because quite frankly, we know there are cases in society where, unfortunately, both in the past and in the present, if you are from a certain demographic group or your name is not westernized or something like that, you're not paid as much or you're not hired. And so I feel like, I hear like how Stanford is talking about AI existentialism. I'm like, Stanford, stop. You have human society problems that actually, guess what? If you solve those same methods can actually be applied to AI, and it can be much more relevant in the near term. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
So one of the things you mentioned is first competency of these systems and of what's it called, corporations as a whole. I'd agree with you that these three qualities are what people need for trust, or what they want for trust. Competency is, well, my essential argument here is that each of those things is a perspective-based thing. So in competency, you might say, oh, these countries, these corporations are incompetent in what they're doing. The counter argument is that they're not trying to do what you think they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is make money, and by the fact that they're still existing, they're competent. Like
100%, yes,
by
exactly.
definition.
Right.
So the benevolence is, of course, also a very perspective skewed thing. Benevolence just means it's good for me. Most of the time, unless you have, sort of super ego development, you can understand the concepts of like, oh, this is good for society, this is good for a multitude of people, even if it is harmful for me. But that's a perspective issue. It was benevolence, competence. What was the third?
And integrity.
Integrity. Yeah, I distrust everything, so I just think people should, operate on a basic premise of distrust.
Yep. Well, I'm with you. So I would say 100%. There's a wonderful video by CGP Grey. He did in, I think, 2015, which is Rules for Rulers, where he points out, plenty of us can do the armchair quarterbacking and say, why did that decision maker make the following decision? But the reality is, if you're in a society like ours, you got to get elected. And that means you got to serve key holders. And if you don't meet the needs of the key holders, guess what? Someone else is going to peddle to the needs of the key holders. And so what we may think as is either non-benevolent or non-integrity means is just them doing what's necessary to get in office. And anyone else who played the game differently may end up not getting elected. I mean, you go back to the Federalist Papers, and James Madison argued in Federalist Papers number 51, he wanted ambition to counter ambition. So the assumption was there was going to be ambitious people running for office. And the way you had checks and balances was just to pit those ambitious people against other ambitious people. So sort of like what you're saying, Max, about for AI.
Exactly.
Same thing with Putin. I mean, people may look at Putin and say he's being non-benevolent and everything like that. He's still in power until he isn't. But I'm just saying, it's easy for people to look back and say, that's not what I would do, or I'm not willing to do that. But there probably is, that person is probably seeking to maximize. And that, again, goes back to Herb Simon, which is decision-making in administrative organizations. They optimize for a local maximum. But again, it may not be the maximum we would choose. I think... Go ahead.
I think one of the ways... So I think people are going to trust these systems, whether or not it's advisable that they do trust them. And I think one of the ways that, to get back to this argument of extreme AI proliferation, is that one of the ways that you can at least take steps towards making these trustworthy is divorcing them from large powers. You shouldn't be using OpenAI's ChatGPT. You shouldn't be using Facebook's AI system. You shouldn't be using Bard. What you should be using is your own system that's open source, that you have, that runs on local hardware, that isn't being manipulated, or at least as little manipulated. I'm sure there will be some form of psychological warfare for AIs too, but we're one step at a time here. But to divorce these things from external interest as much as possible, because I don't see a world in which this technology, evaporates. I think it's going to get better, and I think it's going to be very useful, and if people are going to want to use it, it's going to be like the problem that I think our society is realizing, many of us, probably everyone on this call and most of the people watching have already realized, is that allowing Google to have a monopoly on search was a terrible, terrible choice for the concept of democracy, because republics and representative democracies don't work if you don't have an informed electorate. It's sort of step one of having a vote that matters is knowing what your vote is, knowing what you're doing. And if you have a central authority controlling that information, well, you don't have you don't have that anymore. So it's Google is as much a threat to the concepts of democracy as anything else, because everyone knows they manipulate their search results. If instead we had followed a path where everyone has their own private sort of search engine, like a Cirx type of distribution. Now, this is a little bit ridiculous to ask everyone to set up a web crawlers and spiders and Cirx instance. It's a little ridiculous, but I think these AIs are a lot simpler, and will be shortly, for people to set up on their own and to run on their own, and therefore have some closer modicum of trust.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. And again, replace it with organizations or replace it with governments.
Yes.
That's what we dealt with in the 1700s when we tried to figure out, and it's fitting that we're doing this right after the 4th of July. I mean, that is what we dealt with, which is you could not trust the king. So again, not that representative forms of government are perfect, not that the politicians are always benevolent, but by distributing the power, it's not, and this is a wonderful, I think it's from the Dictator's Handbook. It's not that the leaders in democracies and republics are more benevolent than those in autocracies. It's just that their interests are more aligned with those of the stakeholders, more of the stakeholders than an autocracy by itself. An autocracy by itself only has to deal with a few key holders. What we've done is we've distributed so there's more key holders involved. And so I would agree with you 100%. And I think actually, you look at Stanford's, I think it's Llama, you look at what Berkeley has done. I think the reason why you're seeing this part of this fear and this call for regulation is the big companies have realized the democratization of these tools is happening at a very fast rate, unprecedented fast rate. And so their time to recoup the $10 billion or more they just paid for it is shrinking when you can run it on commercial grade hardware for between 300 to 600, depending on whether you talk to Berkeley or Stanford. And so I agree with you, that is the future. It needs to be a better interface than what Solid has. With all respect to Tim Berners-Lee, Solid needs a better UI. The killer UI will solve a lot of this. You may not be able to monetize that UI. I hope you don't monetize that UI. Otherwise, we're back in the same trap all over again. But it will have to be benevolent people that create a very functional UI. So it is a personal AI for the person. And that is the solution of what we do in the United States. Again, not perfect. There will be super empowered people that may have their AIs have more access to data than others, and therefore they have additional clout. But with you 100%, it will balance things out. It also points to where we're going, which is I tell good people, the good news is we're democratizing technology. The bad news is we're democratizing technology. With your smartphone, you can now do things that only the KGB and the CIA could do 40 or 50 years ago. And so when people wonder, why is there so much disinformation? I'm like, because we democratized the production of it, which was also the 1890s, but conversation for another day. And so we will have to deal with the fact that people are able to do what only a few nation state powers could do 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, you see the articles about, oh no, now people can do synthetic biology with AI. Well, one, you could do it without AI. AI doesn't really change anything. But yes, people are going to be able to use nucleotide printers, which are right now about $500,000, to print nucleotide by nucleotide, whether they want to do their own vaccine or something really awful. And so we're going to need to have smoke detectors, the equivalent of smoke detectors for unknown biological contaminants, because that $500,000 nucleotide printer in a few years will be 50,000, in a few years will be 5,000. And most people use it for mundane purposes. I'm waiting for the cat photos version in synthetic biology, but some people will use it for good and some will use it for psychopathic reasons.
The nucleotide printers, I assume you're familiar with not Bentham. Oh Lord, what's his name? The black ball hypothesis, or the fragile world. What's his name? No, I keep thinking of Jeremy Bentham. That's obviously not it. What's his?
I'm not familiar with this. What's the fragile world?
Yeah, the fragile world hypothesis, and I can't believe I can't remember the man's name. I believe he's out of Cambridge. A modern philosopher, still alive. Comes up with this idea, like, let's pretend there's a I believe the thought experiment is as such. There's a goddess with an urn, and she's giving everyone ideas. The urn has in it a bunch of these different ideas, and the ideas are color-coded. They're either white, black, or gray. The white ones are perfectly good ideas. There's no downside to this technology. There's no downside to this. It's just benefits everyone. It's wonderful. This is like the polio vaccine is a white ball. A gray ball is something where there's a good to it, but there's also bad to it. A sort of, I would say, perfectly 50-50 gray ball might be something like nuclear energy, where it's like, we get the bomb, but we also get a nuclear reactor. And a perfectly black ball is something that is just bad. Like, let's say we've been very lucky, but there hasn't been. What if you could make a nuclear explosion or nuclear detonation by microwaving a grape? What if it was just that simple? Like it's just, oops, that's how physics works. No one realized it, but you
We
can do that,
democratized
and
nuclear
then,
power. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah,
Yes.
but make it trivially simple.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
Yeah.
How do you structure a government in which there could be trivially simple nuclear bombs being invented all the time because someone's going to be crazy enough to set one off? And his solution is, panopticon. This is why I'm thinking of Bentham is his solution is like global autocracy, panopticon. I think his actual solution was a total communications and everything kill switch, where the moment one of these ideas is found, everything stops and that person's taken out by a hit squad.
Yeah. So
So I don't think that's a viable solution.
So and I know the philosophical framing. So in a past life, way back in 2000, I was with a small 30-person team called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program, and we were counter bioterrorism, obviously. And you have to wonder, like, what kind of world are we in which we even need to have a counter bioterrorism program? Because who would ever choose to use bioterrorism as a weapon? I mean, it's not really effective at killing a lot of people, despite what people say. It's a more an agent of fear, and the fact that you can't see it makes everybody think they've been exposed to it, even if they haven't. And I was actually, it was scheduled weeks in advance for me to give a briefing to the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. That briefing just happened to be scheduled for September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning. So of course,
No.
Incredible.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
Nick Bostrom, by the way. I think we may have lost David here.
Yeah, I think he froze for a second there.
It's the vulnerable world hypothesis by Nick Bostrom.
Yeah, Nick Bostrom thinks up a lot of scary stuff, doesn't he?
It's fun though.
So hopefully David can come back soon. As far as you know, we haven't found any of these black balls.
Nope. But what he's suggesting, the reason I bring that up is he's suggesting these nucleotide printers would invariably lead to a black ball, where it's like, oh, it costs $50 to buy a nucleotide printer at Walmart, or actually you 3D print your own, and it'll just start kicking out whatever you want, and then you ask the AI to print you some terrible super Ebola that spreads through thought.
I still think that's a gray ball. I think it's a gray ball because you can still print the good stuff.
That's what I was gonna argue, is that you can, if you can print, the bad thing, stands to reason that you could also print let's say the cure for this. Now, that's not, some biologists would immediately go out and say, hey, just because you can make something bad doesn't mean you immediately can make the counter to that thing. But that's correct. But we're also arguing in a paradigm where we have super intelligences. So maybe they can figure it out.
Yeah. So I can think of things that are maybe the white balls, like you said, some of the vaccines. And I can think of gray balls, but I can't even think of a single black ball technology.
Well, that's actually addressed in Bostrom's papers, that there hasn't been one, but it stands to reason that maybe there could be. And what if it's simple? And that's his fears. They're a simple black ball, because you might argue that something like anthrax development is a black ball. Like, there's nothing good that's coming from artificial anthrax being
Good point.
created
Good point.
and disseminated.
All right,
right,
so we're going to
welcome
assume
back.
that your Zoom communications are secure, and that
Yes.
just happened to be coincidental.
Yes,
I'm sure, Graham,
yes.
you have nothing installed on your computer, or Zoom is secure. But regardless, so didn't respond.
Morning of 9/11.
Yes,
That's
morning of
where we lost
9/11. Was supposed to give a briefing, dealt with the response to 9/11 for 3 weeks, stood down from high alert on October 1st, ended up briefing the CIA on October 3rd, and had the first case of anthrax show up in Florida on October 4th. So it was a very busy time. And we actually did warn about, you needed to do postal prophylaxis if you decided to, because at the time, again, remember, first case of anthrax, was not clear it was coming from the postal system, but we were a 30-person organization and a 15,000-person organization. And so we warned, and of course, that's when you begin to realize hierarchies are really inefficient at responding to turbulent environments. And that's led to my whole career after that. But I raise that because what kind of world requires even to have a counter bioterrorism program? And it's where you come back to that for evolutionary, as outcomes of evolution, depending on who you talk to, whether you talk to our own NIH here in the United States or NHS, National Health Services in the UK, between 1% to 2% of humans are psychopathic, meaning they do not have the same emotional response to hurting another human being. Obviously, at some point in time in our evolutionary history, that had some natural selection advantage. Fortunately, hopefully, we're not in a world where that is the case now. By the way, the good news of today's world, you are much less likely to be killed by another human being. The other good news about the world, as opposed to any other time before, there have been times in our history where you had a 1 in 10 chance of being killed by another human being. We're nowhere near that at the moment. And the good news is we're about 8 billion people. The other good news about the world, we're not even in the top 30 most violent species relative to intra-species violence. There are 30 other species on this planet that are actually more likely to kill other members of their species than we are currently. So
Makes sense.
Regardless, again, evolution is a blind watchmaker, and it's not clear that intelligence is a long-term evolutionary advantage, because again, we're searching for extraterrestrial life and we can't find anything. So it could very well be intelligence is self-defeating. But I raise that because, again, think about AI. I keep on coming back to, we have solved this for, it's not perfect for governments, but we solved this for governments. We're now trying to figure out what we do with organizations, because organizations really only have one reason for being: return on investment, to maximize their profits, both internally as well as return on investment for shareholders, whereas governments have multiple reasons. And so we've got to figure that out. How do we live in a world in which companies may have as much power, if not more power, than governments do on influencing us? And we've had this before. I mean, the church used to have a much larger influence on people's lives before governments. Churches and religious influences, for the most part, have waned and been replaced by governments. Governments may be on the wane out. Now we may see organizations. We've dealt with this before, but all this AI stuff in some respects is just the pay no attention to the person behind the curtain sort of thing. It's really the organizations. And I do agree. Part of it is you've got to have autonomy of what you go and seek and what you interface with. There's a book by E10 Banks, Scottish author. I highly recommend, if you've never read any of his books, The Culture.
I love his stuff.
Yeah,
culture.
The player of games. I'm not going to reveal the player of game solution, but it's very much what we're just talking about here, which is everybody has their own AI, plus drones that can actually, if for whatever reason Max tried to do something to my person that I had not given consent to, the drone would politely push Max back. It wouldn't kill him unless he was trying to do lethal force that was trying to be applied to me. But it's essentially national security at the level of one, and that may be where we have to go. So we are going to be in an interesting, challenging transition period between the influence of nation state governments. And there's going to be some that are going to try and double down on that influence. China, let's see if Zoom kicks me off now. But anyway, 1.4 billion people. I mean, you see, she has basically warned both all the tech execs in PRC, and he's also gone out and told the regulators that regulate the tech companies he will buy no sympathy towards the tech companies in that country. So he's doubling down on the nation state, the autocratic model. The US is still, we're like all things. And you got Europe, and as much as I love my European counterparts, they're actual, like, what can you actually get done versus what you can signal? Do you want to have innovators in your country? But, again, we'll get through this. We've been through this. And so I guess I'll just conclude with the idea that if you do look at E10 Banks' books, which I highly recommend because they're non-dystopian visions of the future, and I think we need more sci-fi that is non-dystopian. I get it. It's hard to sell a book that is like, everything's going to be all right and everyone's going to hold hands and it's going to be kumbaya. And I'm not saying that. But, we need more. I mean, we don't even have a vision for 2030 in which China and the United States coexist peacefully. And that's sad, because if we don't have that, if we don't have how do we use technology to get through climate change, then we are essentially raising a generation of young folks who all they're being fed is the world is ending, end is nigh, AI is going to kill you. If it doesn't kill you, then climate change is going to kill you. And if that doesn't kill you, biology is going to kill you. I mean, where is our original Star Trek moment that shows that, yes, we will get to the 24th century and we will not be killing each other?
And life will be better in every measurable way.
Right. And it'll be diverse. It will actually have the expression of ideas. You can coexist and things like that. And I think it can be done. I mean, it would make a fascinating graphical novel if you talked about how do we make choices from 2030 to 2040 to 2050, first to deal with the fact that there is going to be displacement of jobs. I'm not sure. I mean, in one hand, we've always seen the reduction of work hours occur. I mean, it used to be when we were hunter-gatherers, you worked 24/7. Not fun. And then when we actually moved to actually in factories recently with industrialization, you work 6 days a week at 12 hours, if not more. And then supposedly it went to 9-to-5 jobs. I'm not sure, was 9-to-5 really real or a myth? And now
just to interrupt you for a second there,
Sure.
There's an interesting arc you've drawn of history that I don't think is entirely correct. The hunter-gatherers probably worked, as far as I'm aware, around 3 to 4 hours a day. Doesn't take much to go out, stand in a stand for a couple hours, find a deer. You go there, there's a whole bunch of edible foods if you actually learn how to do foraging. Couple hours, you can get all your calories for many people for a day. And it actually took a lot of social technology to get people to leave that and to actually increase their hourly working rate to work in fields. The introduction of agriculture needed some extraordinary benefit to move people from that. And so the thinking goes, the benefit was buildings. If you you can't be a hunter-gatherer and stay in the same place, you have to be migratory.
Well,
But-
and so, but I've seen those analyses that they only focus on the actual act of hunting. And so I'm thinking you have
And
to
gathering.
migrate, you have to move your shelters, you actually have to do, I mean, you also have to watch for attackers. At least in a city, you've got a city wall and you've actually got, so I don't know.
Well, that's the trade-off. That's the
Yeah.
trade-off that they made, is that
Yeah.
we can be, if you're too many people in an area, they're going to start fighting. All of a sudden, it becomes better to actually have a single place with walls that you can, Mott and Bailey, you can defend this area and like go out. Okay, we'll spend more time in the fields. We'll work harder, but we won't be killed.
Correct. And that's what I would say is the and I've seen the research that argues that somehow things were better. I kind of think it's like the Make America Great Again campaign. It's like, let's just go back. And I'm like, you're only counting the hunting gathering part, which is I can guarantee you were a nomadic group. You had no walls that you could fall asleep in and say we're safe. You had to put somebody on sentry duty 24/7. So I think they may just be looking at one piece of the puzzle. And again, it may just be convenience for the argument.
You had to keep the fire going all night.
But I do think civilization happens because people are lazy. We are always looking for getting better outputs with minimal amount of work. We rarely say we want to work more for less outputs. And I think, and again, if anything, you look at where we are now, there's not much you actually have to do other than you have to pay taxes, occasionally serve on a jury. You don't have to vote. You don't have to do military service. There is nothing that requires you to do anything else for the state, at least in our country. And in some respects, that may be part of our problem is we don't have a shared sense of us because there are those few people we have delegated to, do the law enforcement, do the national security bit. I'm going to go over here. And now you've got the tech companies that are like, do we need those things? Well, I would argue yes, because if a large nation state power decided to show up on your doorstep and take away your company, you got problems. But that is part of the turbulence we're experiencing is what is the social contract that we want going forward?
Right. To bring it to a something that keeps coming up, this concept of my argument here is also applicable to organizations. I think we're going to see a dramatic overhaul in the structure of organizations because these systems are what I would call hyper facilitators. The amount you can get done if you have one of these things that's actually, competent, the amount you can develop, make your own, is absolutely phenomenal. And my sort of vision of the future of these things is all the grunt work, the paperwork, the things that no one actually wants to do is going to be automated. And it doesn't matter how much regulation there is around something, you can just actually automate most of the regulatory processes away to it. So companies will be, startups at least initially will be a whole lot smaller. You'll need a lot fewer people. You'll have a lot more startups. The structure of how companies are going to relate to each other in 10 years is going to be vastly different than anything that we've seen before. The idea of that you need an administrative body to take care of, an HR admin group in a company will be a thing of the past. It's essentially a potential barrier for, I don't know. Sorry, my background's in physics, so I always go back to physics analogies. But a tunneling phenomena, there's this potential barrier, and you have to tunnel through it, or get over it somehow. I think what we're going to see is that these AI will let us, tunnel right through, get through these processes, and corporations will be smaller. That's not to say that capital will be smaller. I think you'll find that there will be fewer, more powerful people who just got their systems to make the right thing that people desired. But you won't have these sort of cyberpunk monolith corporations that it's like the state of Walmart isn't. You're not going to find that.
Well,
So- Oh, go ahead, Graham.
I'd like to bring it back to a final decision or final action point we can take here. So, oh, sorry, one of my Alexas or something is talking to me.
No worries. Just come online. There's the AI is trying to squelch the future
Yeah.
you're trying to produce. Real quick, while you come back, Graham, I would say I 100% agree with you, Max. And actually, believe it or not, that's actually what motivated me to get my PhD in 2005 was the changing model of organizations. And so I was arguing that for the 1940s and 1950s, we organized by top-down hierarchies because information was scarce and communication latency was high. And so hierarchies were very efficient for that because you had scarce information. You also had large latency costs. And I argued that actually what you wanted to do, especially if you're facing turbulent environments, is kind of flip it. And so you can't have a completely flat organization, despite what large tech companies say. If anytime you're beyond 100 people, you can't claim you're flat. I'm sorry, that does not work. That's called anarchy. But you can have bottoms up. And so it changes the role of a quote unquote manager. Instead of forcing their view on their reports, they're going to reports and say, here's the goal we're looking for. Which different options have you and which one of you are achieving it the best? In some respects, it's the same objective function that you give to an AI, which is, okay, I'm trying to achieve this. Which one of you are doing the best? Okay, then I'm going to reward you and do more. And then we will constantly continue to scan the space because there's many more reports than there are managers. And the manager, in some respects, becomes a cultivator of the good ideas. And it becomes more of an entrepreneurial culture within the organization to bounce things up as opposed to sort of the top-down model. And so I agree with you on that. The other thing that I've also argued is for governments, we need to have people that are essentially freelancers on the inside. So you get approved to serve as a freelancer on the inside. You have projects that you can internally say, I want to work on that. I'm going to bring not just myself, but my AI kit. And I'm also going to bring my network of other people that have other skill sets in this space. And we will tackle this problem. And if we solve it, then we get that sort of track record that goes with us. And so we sort of move up in terms of internal reputations of they were really good at solving this type of problem. And so it really becomes sort of an internal market of the combination of both human and AI kit solving it. I do think people are going to work less hours, which is fine. I mean, again, that's people can spend it on other things. You can spend it on things that you are passionate about that may not be monetary if you make enough money to actually do other things like that. But we do need to figure out the retooling side, because I think there is a very pervasive sense of learned helplessness at the moment in a large part of of not just our country, but in the world. And again, it's a dystopian narratives. People have been told these problems are bigger than you, you can't solve them. And what I would say is no, actually, like Graham opened up with, the best way to predict the future is to create it yourself.
All right, so that's awesome stuff. So a government that has been told by their population, we want you to regulate AI, are we saying to them, I mean, this is what I think we're saying to them. What I want to say to them is ecological safety, or this broad-based allowing the system to regulate itself by everybody having ambition, and ambition meeting ambition. That's the way to go. So the best regulation is no regulation. Is that what we're saying?
No.
That's my argument.
Well, I can hear that and I can see that, but I would say that only works if everyone starts at the same starting position. It's like a complex adaptive system. You can only control the starting position. And the reality is some people are starting with supersized resources relative to everybody else. So if you didn't have that, then great. Maybe there's a chance it would balance itself out. But right now you have supersized resources relative to other people. You have people that through no fault of their own have been just basically told you can't do it. You know, your demographics put you in a different group or things like that. And so there are things that we have to do to recognize that the phrase all men and women are created equal is an ideal that we hold, even if right now we're not actually a society that is real in that nature. And so whatever rules that we approach should be trying to craft the idea that everybody is equal. And again, recognizing you don't want to take away ambition, you don't want to take away creativity, you don't want to take away motivations. But if someone starts off with a 1000x advantage over somebody else, we may want to think about rules that can balance it out. And I will say I'm a Rawlsian. So John Rawls argues that basically if we don't know who we are going to be before we're born, what would we agree to? And basically it's a world in which those that are the worst off are the least worst off relative to every other possible permeation that we do. And again, it's not taking away motivation. It's not taking away the ability to move up. There should be opportunity for advancement. I look at the military, actually, which is really good at right now removing names, removing demographic information from both promotion and retention. How much of the private sector does any of these practices where they remove names or demographics or anything like that? And so I would argue that you're going to need some. I don't know if I'd use the word regulation because it's not exactly regulation. It's the social contract that we have agreed to interact in this world. I would also argue that increasingly things are transnational in nature. So unless you want to force everything offshore, be very careful what you do. But I do think the very solutions we're talking about with AI, they actually apply to large organizations too.
I would agree with you in terms of the goals here. However, I think that any sort of regulation that government might put on it is going to inhibit that sort of push for equality amongst mind. Is if you have more regulation, there's more things people have to deal with in order to get these systems, in order to use these systems, that's less that they can do with these systems. These are facilitation engines unlike any seen before in the history of humanity. And if you want to allow people to do things, this is how you do it. So you give them these systems. The more of these that people are, you said earlier that this is a UI problem.
Mm-hmm.
If we can make a good UI to get people working on these, working with these, that is so much. And because these systems are roughly comparable, sure, there are different systems that are better at different things, but they will be growing. They will get better over time. The new models will come out, and actually I'm very proud of the sort of redemption arc of Facebook, where they've released Llama, accidentally or not. They've still released it, still out in the wild. People can still go use some of the expensive, extremely powerful models on their own. You can run this on a Raspberry Pi. The compute isn't restricted terribly much. So if you were to put gateways in front of that, you're actually pushing against the democratization of this technology. You're pushing against the equality of man.
Oh, so I completely agree that there are people that are trying to take a playbook from the Gilded Age and do regulatory moats. But here are the two things I would suggest, since we can get to brass tacks before we wrap up. One, we haven't talked a lot about data. And these things don't operate in a vacuum. They operate with data. And right now, there are a few players that have not even 1000x. They probably have a million, if not a billionx advantage relative to data that can be used to train these machines as opposed to others. And so what I would love to see is the incentivization. And so in some respects, this is not even regulation, the incentivization of what I would call data cooperatives or data trust. And this is actually called out in the UK government's 2017 report, which is basically people can come together either by geography or by interest and say, we are collectively representing the data exhaust for ourselves. And we have elected one or two or three or whatever number of people to represent our interests because we don't have the time to spend to that. And these individuals now can broker with companies and say, if you want to use our data, here's what we expect in return. You either use it for this purpose, it may be financial return, it may not be financial return. You can use it for Alzheimer's research, but you can't use it for ads to be delivered to us or whatever. But you basically, if you start doing that, that is now a counterbalance to the existing fact that they are, what we did in the last decade is we allowed the railroad tycoons to rise. And right now we're trying to say, everyone be a railroad tycoon. It's like, there's already incumbent players that have a million, if not billion X advantage. And so I would be for that. The second thing I would actually argue is the recognition that you do have a right to be left alone. And actually, we've done a very good job about protecting that vigilantly in the United States for the most part from governments, but from organizations, there is no right to be left alone. And maybe we need to allow that, including to opt out of all, being off the internet altogether. And so those would be the two small fixes that are not cataclysmic, that I don't think are putting a prohibitive gate to this. But if we don't do that, I worry that if you don't have the right to be left alone, and if there's not a way to collectively allow individuals to organize to use their data, then it's going to be again, winner take all that we've already seen play itself out over the last decade.
Good. Very good. I love it. All right. Thank you, guys. This has been a great
Max.
talk.
Thank you, Graham. We appreciate it.
Yes.
It
So
was
nice
great.
to talk to you. So nice to meet you.
All right.
Take care, guys.
All right. See you. Bye-bye.
Take care.